Hello, I'm Tony Christ, out at the beach on St. Patty's Day, of all things, ready to do our podcast. Hopefully, you're going to find this interesting. But before we get to it, the podcast is called the Ides of March. And here we are in the middle of March, right on St. Patty's Day. I'm wearing a commemorable green shirt. And why shouldn't I be? Uh, I'll tell you why. I'm not Irish. I'm actually Greek, but I had some very dear Irish friends, and my favorite color happens to be green. So here I am on St. Patty's Day. We're going to do a podcast, Ides of March, and sub called the Federal Reserve's quagmire. And before we do, we left the triads and the Chinese a week ago. I want to tell you next week, whether we have Ishmael or not, we're going to go to TikTok. We're going to go to some other details. We're going to go back to the Chinese and show how they're conducting their war against America. And we're going to continue that discussion, but that will be next week. Today is St. Patty's Day. So we need to go to the Federal Reserve, the quagmire of the Federal Reserve. And that raises a question. What's a quagmire? Well, a quagmire, in this instance, is a difficult, precarious, and entrapping position. So it's not something you want to be. You don't want to be in a quagmire. Even if you're not the Federal Reserve, you don't want to be in a quagmire. So what is the Federal Reserve's quagmire? Well, let's take a look. In March of 2020, the Federal Reserve announced a reduction of reserve requirements for U.S. banks to zero. What? Unheard of. Look, I'm an old guy, but never in my life have reserve requirements gone to zero. Now, there's a lot of stories. That could be a whole different podcast on reserve requirements. Reserve requirements protect a bank. They also limit the amount of money a bank can lend because they're required to keep some in reserves. So it was very interesting to me to know that they were taken to zero. Now, the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient. That language was in the Federal Reserve's March 2023 minutes that were released to the public, but they took it out. Why would they take out the language, the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient? I mean, that's almost funny, but it's not. I mean, I have money in a bank, and I'm certain you guys have money in a bank too. It's a little worrisome, I would say. So, what is going on? Janet Yellen, in response to the failures of three banks in America. If you recall, on March 11th, 2023, there were three bank failures in America sequentially up through May that totaled $500 billion. And Janet Yellen set up a loan service. And the loan service offered loans to banks. Now, you know how when you go to get a loan from a bank or a mortgage company, you have to put collateral on. And when you put your collateral up, they won't let you borrow 100% on your collateral. They'll lend you 80% or some number lower than your collateral. And even if you do an appraisal and you tell the bank your collateral's worth, say, X dollars, you know they're going to send their own appraiser to evaluate what that collateral's worth. Well, catch this. Yellen told the banks that they could borrow money from the Federal Reserve even if their collateral wasn't worth 100% of the loan. Now, let me explain a little bit. The banks had government bonds that they had accumulated. And the government bonds from 22, about March, to about 23 March went down in value significantly. And why was that? Now think about it. Why would a government bond go down in its value? I mean, it's a secure thing, and you paid so much money, and one day you're supposedly going to get your money back. It went down in value because the interest rates went up because we had inflation, and we still do, incidentally. So all the banks were holding government bonds, and they went down in value. They went down in value. You know how much cumulatively? $1.5 trillion. So Yellen said, well, listen, disregard the fact that your asset, your collateral, is lower than what you want to borrow. We'll lend you on the maturity rate. So they all ran up, and by February 29, 24, $163 billion had been borrowed, mostly by regional banks, putting up not enough collateral. Now, how can they do that? Well, they're the Federal Reserve. That suggests a moral hazard. Now, what do you mean by a moral hazard? Well, moral hazard in economics is a situation in which one party engages in risky behavior or fails to act in good faith because it knows another party bears the economic consequences. Now, let's look at that for a minute. In other words, when I make a decision or I do an exchange, and it's my decision, and I'm doing a transaction, a market transaction, I'll get the benefit and the consequences. But if I'm doing an exchange and I know somebody else will get a bad consequence, in this case, it's the public, us, then I'm gonna do more of it. I mean, why wouldn't I? And that's exactly what the banks did, because the Federal Reserve offered it. So they borrowed and they borrowed and they borrowed. Now, Janet Yellen even went further, and she said even the banks that aren't borrowing, but whose bonds are down $1.5 trillion, can mark their bonds to par. In other words, they can lie. They can tell everybody they're worth quite a bit more than they actually were. Well, that too is a moral hazard, and that's an ongoing moral hazard. And if there's failings and a bank is unable to pay an obligation, guess what happens? John Q. Public drops in through the Federal Reserve, because they transfer that obligation to us. Now, it's even worse than that. If we look at this century and we look at the Federal Reserve and we look at what they've done and where we are, and it's important to do that. The Federal Reserve is often treated like gods. I mean, if you listen to the questions of Mr. Powell in his monthly meetings, you'd think they were questioning a saint. I wish I could question him for 5 minutes. I'd bring a sobriety to that interview that nobody's heard. So why am I raising this? Why should we be alarmed about what the Federal Reserve is doing? Well, if you go back to the beginning of this century and you go to a period 2005, 2007, 2008, we fell into a pretty severe recession. A recession which Ben Bernanke, who was the Fed chief at the time, saw no sign that was coming. He wasn't even aware of it. But when it hit, he started to take us on a different course. He was very worried that we would fall into a depression. So he started funding, through printing money, the economy. And at the time, the economy wasn't responding with any inflationary surge. So he kept doing it. And he called it quantitative easing. Quantitative easing literally means that the Federal Reserve is printing money. Now, when they print money, what does that mean? Well, there's not a place where money is being printed and carted around in wheelbarrows or anything like that. It's nothing other than a computer entry into a Federal Reserve bank. So let's say they want $1 billion to appear. They put a one and an appropriate number of zeros after it and on a computer and make it appear on the bank's balance sheet. Now you just can't make it appear. So the bank in turn sells them what? US Treasury bonds. So the Fed buys those US Treasury bonds, and that money, which didn't exist a second before, exists. Voila, there it is. That bank has it. Well, this is what they did. And they started with this quantitative easing, which is a fancy term for printing money, under Bernanke in 2008. They called it QE1. And then in 2010, they did QE2. And then in 2012 to 2014, they did QE3. Okay. So they were printing away under Benedict Bernanke. Oh my God, he was a savior. The money was coming in. We were paying for our debt. The interest rates are held very low. And this didn't communicate the right thing to the Congress either, because the Congress sees very low interest rates. And what do you think they do? They borrow. So when Benedict started this, the national debt was somewhere around 8 or 9 trillion. We'd just gone through Bush, and we're ready to get Obama in 2009. After Obama's turn, it went from 8 to 9 trillion to 19 trillion. Now he was there 8 years. Then after Trump's term, which was only 4 years, it went to 27 trillion, 7.7 trillion. Now Biden's going to set another record. He's going to beat Trump. The debt this year should hit 35 to 36 trillion, which would be 8.5 trillion, outclassing Trump. Now remember, Trump and Biden together were 8 years. So if you add them together, you get over 16 trillion compared to Obama's 9 trillion. But the three of them have taken our debt from 9 trillion up to, let's call it 36 trillion, because we're still going up. We're going up at the rate of $1 trillion every 3 months. And this process that Benedict Bernanke started and got a Nobel Prize for, believe it, he should have been locked up in jail, is called quantitative easing, printing of money and holding the interest rates low. And that was the environment up until the middle of 22 that we proceeded on this century. And that was the environment that created the inflation that we're suffering and we're not done with. I'll give you one thought on that, if you will. Housing prices have gone up over 60%, 60% in 2.5 years. Now, how funny it is that the Federal Reserve doesn't count housing prices in the CPI, nor does the PCE count housing prices. So that shows you how, if you put housing prices in and you weight them on the size of the total value of all housing in America against assets, the CPI would be 10% today. Okay, but we love honesty and deception, and really the CPI, you can compare it to itself in the past, but you can't compare it to the realities we face. It's understating inflation. So basically, this quantitative easing started by Ben Bernanke, and the fact that they held interest rates at an artificially low level for so long created this massive amount of debt. And in short, Ben Bernanke printed in total, the Federal Reserve had less than 3 trillion on less than 400 billion on its balance sheet. Today it has 7.6 trillion. 4.6 trillion was printed from 22 March from 2022 from 2022 March to 2020 from 2020 March to 2022 March. 4.6 trillion was printed. Then finally, there was a bit of sobriety when inflation shot up. Finally. See, when you print money, you increase the amount of dollars you have and everything else stays the same. Well, guess what? The prices go up, so they exchange in the same way. So this is not rocket science. This is just facts that you'll never hear from the Federal Reserve, who created the problems we've had, and now in the last year is trying to take credit for resolving the problem they created. And it's going to be much stickier. So going back to moral hazard and why we're very concerned about it, remember, we are the ones, the public, the only relief the Federal Reserve can give is it can take some actors' malfeasance or misdeed or riskful behavior, which is the case in the banks, and transfer that cost to who? To us. We have to pay. So that's the trick the Federal Reserve does, and that's why everybody worships them, God knows why, because they do that. They transfer it to us. There is a theoretical reasoning that it's better if we all pay it than if that schmo in that bank went bankrupt. Well, we didn't used to think that way, but we certainly think that way now. Although the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to achieve maximum employment and keep prices stable, despite all the machinations, the one thing for certain is the moral hazards the Fed creates by facilitating or ensuring riskful behavior are always borne by us, the public. Unaddressed, the Federal Reserve quagmire goes on, and the public unwittingly bears all the losses too often, merely addressing a theoretical problem. That simply means they're thinking that the failure of whatever they're talking about to save with our money is going to be so bad that we better all pay to save it. Of course, it's our money. It's not money previously collected by the government. It's a tax on us every time they act, because even if they're printing money, it's devaluing all of our assets when prices go up. And now they're in a quandary. They're in between a rock and a hard place because the debts are out of control. The debts are going straight up, and they have no way to stop this train that's not going to require, frankly, some economic pain. And so that's the problem. They're just, basically, I have a very good friend I've known a long time, and he says, Tony, they're just going to do everything they can to put it off till after the election. Now, we had a podcast this mid-December, and we predicted that a recession would start in April. But I've got to tell you, I've been surprised at the amount of capital, the amount of fiscal spending that the government has thrown in the system and how resilient it's been. But I'm not willing to back down from what I said. And I also said it would start in April, but it wouldn't be known publicly till July or August. So I'm not willing to back down from that yet. But if my friend is right and they're doing everything they can to put it off till next year, my God, it's not going to be a good time by the time we get to next February. In any case, it's important to me that you understand what the Fed is doing and that you have an idea of what a moral hazard is and how they're using it. They're basically using it when they encounter a theoretic problem, a problem of a possible failure. They're saying we can't let them fail, and then they're paying for them not to fail. You've heard the phrase zombie companies and zombie banks. They're keeping them afloat by having us pick up the tab. So that's what's going on. And so don't feel too excited about it when they when they continue doing it. Now, I wouldn't at all be surprised if we get a hiccup from another mid-sized bank in the next couple months either. And that could serve as a shock for the whole system. But now next time, it is St. Patty's Day. We talked about the printing of the excess money starting in March of 2020 and ending in March of 2022. We talked about the Fed getting rid of the requirement to for any type of a requirement for any type of a bank to have save money, getting rid of that requirement in March of 2020. There's just a ton of marches. They reduced that phrase in their March minutes in March of 2023. So that's why, I mean, what more can I say about St. Patty's Day to give it some due respect? Not too much. You'd almost figure I'm Irish, but I'm not. So it's going to be very problematic. There's no magic wand or magic sword. The way we built this nation is to work a day at a time, with individuals being responsible for their decisions, both the benefits and the costs, not by protecting them against the costs federally because of some theoretic problem it would create if they went out of business. And that's the world we've climbed into this century. And we're in it, we're embedded in it pretty deeply. So we'll talk more about this. We do intend next week to get back to the triads and the Chinese. We're going to introduce TikTok. We're going to talk about some other behaviors that are sponsored out of China that are disruptive to our society in the sort of war they're holding against us. So basically, that's our podcast for this St. Patty's Day. And here I am at the beach. Not really. I've just put this background behind me. And I wish you all to have a blessed week. I hope you watch it. The paper is posted on our website, odysseyyinvestments.info. Odyssey Investments, all one word, .info, the paper as well as the podcast. It will also be on YouTube. Sunshine and Transparency is the name of our podcast. I feel honored to bring it to you. I hope you get a chance to watch. Have a blessed week and a very nice St. Patty's Day. And I thank you for watching.